Hey, Steve Kirby here again. In this video, I'm going to show you all of the changes and new features in Limbo 1.5.2. First thing I want to talk about is the biggest update to 1.5.2, which is the addition of these two buttons at the bottom of the script UI panel called Match FK to IK and Match IK to FK. So I'm going to demonstrate what they do with this little walking character here. So I've got this guy in a walk cycle, and that's all animated with his arms on FK. I like to animate arms on FK because I find that the sort of arcs you can get are much smoother, and it also helps to offset the rotation of the lower limb a little bit from the upper, so you can get some kind of breaking of the joints maybe. And then I wanted to show that sometimes when you're animating arms, if you want the hand to kind of grip something or sort of take something or place something, those kind of actions are usually much easier being done with IK. So I've kind of imagined that this right arm reaches up to take something from a shelf or another character or something. So the way I've done that, I haven't actually animated the object or anything, I have to imagine that. But this right wrist blends from being on FK, as I said, up to IK at this point. You can see that FK value's gone down to 0. And then he kind of pulls his arm in towards his chest, and that's these two position keyframes here. They're just completely linear actually. And you can see the motion path of that wrist moving in. But what I'm also doing is trying to animate him turning around. And you can see that as we sort of go further up the timeline, his hips sort of expand and he takes another step with his back leg. And then along here, his shoulders actually twist right round. So that arm, which was in front here, is going to end up there behind and at the back. So in order to kind of like make his arm work with that twisting movement, and you can see his head kind of coming over and everything, I'm going to need to animate his right arm here into a sort of mirror of what it is. So at the moment we have this V that kind of starts at the shoulder and then goes down and up to the right. And what I really need is to sort of have the same pose but mirrored over on the left. So if I was trying to do that with IK, then I'd perhaps come here and animate that hand or wrist position rather over to sort of there somewhere. But obviously now, because he's a puppet, his elbow's gone up in the air, so you sort of think, well, let's change the clockwise in order to match that. So I'm going to animate the clockwise as well in order to get where we want, and that is where we want to end up now. But the animation isn't really what we want because clockwise doesn't really work like that, so it goes kind of Yankee in the middle there. So let's just undo those sort of keyframes that we've set there. So really the only way of getting this this V shape to be mirrored and for it to stay, this arm to stay the right length the whole time, is to do it on FK, where it would actually be pretty straightforward. But at the moment, if I just come over to my full FK, I've still got my arm in this kind of backward pose from the walk cycle. That's what these last two keyframes here were. They're just the same keyframes as throughout the cycle when his arm is swung back behind him. So we don't need that. We need that pose of the FK rotation properties to match the IK pose, like this. And of course, I could just try and do that manually by switching over to FK and then kind of fiddling around with these rotation properties here, and then sort of like coming back and sort of seeing, okay, is it near? No, it's not quite there yet, and fiddling around with it. But it takes a while, and there's just no need for any of that. So what we can do now with the new version is we can select our controller and click on the Match FK to IK button, and it's going to place these two new keyframes on our FK rotation values. And now I can just blend, or in this case I'm going to actually switch, because this is a hold keyframe here, so my next keyframe is going to be hold as well. I'm going to turn that right up from 0 to 100 on that frame, but it's going to match perfectly because of the script's ability to sort of read the maths and set those keyframes to be exactly what they need to be. So now I'm back on FK. And as I come through this sort of body twist, all I really need to do is just change those values there. So the lower rotation is going to have to kind of come across to the other side there, and then the upper rotation just needs to be kind of the other side of 180 degrees like that. And now I've got that V facing to the left, which is how I wanted it, but it gets there in the right kind of movement across with this kind of sort of scissor, sort of mirroring action, whatever you want to call it. And that isn't really, possible anywhere other than on FK, but coming from the IK pose, it's been much easier to match that in that way. And if we now wanted that arm to sort of reach out and grab something else in the scene, or perhaps he's reaching down to a table and he's going to place that object that he's taken somewhere else, that's probably going to be easier to do on IK again. But we can just do the same thing again using the other button, matching the IK to the FK like that. And now I get a new position keyframe generated here. And you'll see that my end controller, the normal kind of IK controller, is now slap bang where the FK pose had ended up. So I can now carry on animating on IK, and we haven't actually switched over, so let's also switch over to IK like that. And then, this is all good. And then over here, of course, I can now place that controller down wherever he's going to sort of put that thing, something like that. One thing to look out for when you're using the match IK to FK button is that it doesn't just set the position value for your controller, it will also set the clockwise, because obviously you could have a sort of a position set with your rotation values, your FK rotation values could effectively make that limb either clockwise or anti-clockwise. So the clockwise property is going to be set automatically by that button, and you'll see if we come back in time that it's actually set it to 100% clockwise, which was right for where we ended up, but obviously wasn't right at this point. And because I didn't have my clockwise property, what's it called, like the stopwatch switch wasn't on, it's just switched it over to 100%. So what I really needed to do was have it on minus 100% here somewhere. I'll make that a hold keyframe, and then when we went onto the FK here somewhere, that would need to switch over to I've got the wrong value, that should have been minus 100. Then over here that should be 100 like that. So now we're kind of flipping through anti-clockwise to clockwise, but it happens when we're on full FK at this point here, so it's seamless. And in fact the animation can just kind of carry on and do whatever. I mean, the animation at the end there where he moves his arm down is obviously not very good, but that just needs some time spending on these keyframes and spacing and timing of those. So the match FK to IK and the match IK to FK, they don't enable a functionality that wasn't present before. You could always go in and figure out what those rotations or what that position was manually, but it was pretty difficult to get it exactly right and very fiddly. So the process of kind of moving between IK and FK and back again or whatever could sometimes mean that if you didn't want to use the blending, if you wanted to do a hold keyframe and just suddenly flip from one to the other, it was a bit of a fiddle and a faff to kind of get your keyframes to match perfectly, whereas these buttons just enable that. One other thing to look out for is that if you do try and use them with the anti-pop property turned up, then they don't quite match perfectly in that situation either. But for arms, I find that anti-pop is usually fine on 0. So you may find that if your anti-pop is above 0, then they don't seem to quite match perfectly. But the best thing to do in that situation is just animate the anti-pop down somewhere before you do all these moves. The other button that we've added to Limba's UI panel is this select button here, and all that does is it selects all of the other layers, all the Limba layers that are sort of related to the one that you've currently got selected. So I've got this right wrist selected here, and if I click it, then it'll select my shoulder and arm that are related to that one. Or if I was dealing with my ankle and I click select, it would select the hip and the leg. If you've got any FK or joint controllers in there, it'll select those as well. And all that does is just make it a bit quicker and easier if you want to, for example, label all of your layers a certain color, or maybe you want to just delete a whole limb, and instead of having to sort of go through and find all 3 layers that are part of the set, you can just find one and then click that and you've got them all selected. Okay, so the other new feature that we've introduced in Limba 1.5.2 is the ability for Limba layers to work natively in After Effects 3D space. So previously to 1.5.2, if you wanted to use After Effects camera and lights and everything, the only real way of doing that would be to pre-compose your entire character and make your pre-comp 3D and use that as a sort of single layer inside your 3D comp, which worked okay in many situations, but you would find that the resolution would be limited to whatever size you've created it at. So if you make a character that's a little bit on the small side, and then you set that up as a pre-comp in 3D space and zoom right into it, you'd find that you wouldn't really have sufficient resolution on the character. You couldn't kind of fly a camera really tight into its face or something and still expect the outlines to be crisp because it was getting rasterized at whatever size the pre-comp was. So now you can avoid that by setting everything up kind of natively in 3D. And rather than sort of show you that in situ, I'm just going to kind of take you through the process from scratch, and then I'll come back to this kind of 3D comp here that I've got set up and show you how to do it sort of retrospectively. So let's make a new comp like this and make a new limb. Call that right. There we go. I'm not going to get too kind of clever with the character here. I'm just gonna set this stroke off and draw a rectangle like that. I'm just gonna pretend that's my character's body. In fact, I'll call it body. Put that at the bottom. And then obviously, because it's my character's body, I'm gonna want to parent this hip to it. And obviously now I can, do all my usual IK stuff, and I can rotate this body, and we all know how this kind of stuff works. But now I want to make this whole thing work in 3D space. I'll make a new camera. Of course, there is a default camera, but I'll make one anyway, just to make things clear in this kind of two view setup that I've got going on. And then in order to kind of manipulate your Limba layers and your character as a whole in 3D space, it's really a good idea to use some kind of master null or master controller for the whole character. I kind of tend to recommend doing this in any situation, but it's, I'd say, pretty much essential when working in 3D. So I'm going to make a new null object, and then I'm going to make that null. In fact, I'm going to make everything 3D, not just the null, but all the other layers. So they'll pop into view there. Then I'm going to take this null and position it just kind of somewhere roughly where the body is. So if I just come over here a bit and down, everything's at Z position 0, obviously, because we've only just enabled the 3D switches. I suppose I could correct this, orient this rotation keyframe like that to begin with. So now that I've got this null where I want it in relation to my character, it doesn't have to be in the middle. You can have it off to one side, but it sort of makes a bit more sense for it to be roughly in the middle of your character. I'll call this master. I want to parent every part of my character, every layer that's a part of my character, apart from layers which are already parented to that master controller. So obviously my hip is parented to the body, and if I had other limbs, and if I had a neck and a head and so on, and ears on the head, a lot of those layers are going to be parented to other layers if you set your character up in the sort of standard way. So there's only going to be certain layers that don't have any parents. Usually it's something like the torso or the hips, but it might be that you have a different setup. So in this situation, actually the only one I do have parented to anything is that hip. So I need to leave that as it is and select all the other parts of my character that have this parent drop down set as none. And what's important when we're working with 3D is that we also include the limb layers themselves. Now, normally, your actual limb layers, you probably wouldn't parent to anything because there's no need to. They get sort of positioned automatically by the script. But because Z-depth works a little bit differently, the best way to do this is to include them. So I'm going to select this ankle, which has no parent, the leg, which has no parent, and the body, which has no parent. And I'm going to hook those all up, parent all of them to this master controller here. And once I've done that, I should now be able to move my master controller in Z, and everything else will kind of go along with it. And it also means that I can still carry on playing around with the IK values, but they're just taking place in 3D space now. Obviously, there is a possibility that you might accidentally grab one of these controllers like this and move it around in Z space itself. And if you do that, then everything is going to go a little bit out of whack. You can see that Z value has come away from 0 there. So I'll just undo and set that back to 0. So there is a bit of a gotcha there in terms of like making sure that when you move these controllers around in IK, if you're doing it in a comp window, you need to be careful that you definitely don't have that little Z selected. And if you just grab it with neither of these X or Y axes selected, it should be fine, especially if you're in something like, say, front view, or if you haven't rotated anything in the kind of Y plane, it should be fine. But do keep an eye on those Z values. You could even add an expression here to make sure that the Z values always stay at 0. But generally, I find that if you're kind of doing characters in 3D space, it's maybe a little easier to sort of animate them in 2D first of all, and then move them over to 3D space, simply because all these axes that After Effects shows you when on a 3D layer do make things a little bit awkward to kind of grab and move around. They always seem to go the wrong way for me. I wish there was a sort of planar controller like you get in C4D, but until we get that, the sort of preferred method is either to sort of like animate them in 2D first, or just be sort of very careful not to mess around with these Z values, because the only thing we really want to be able to move in Z is that master controller. So coming back to this comp here, you can see that if I select the camera tool, that we've got this kind of parallax sort of setup going on in 3D space. I've got these kind of buildings in the background and sort of hills, and then there's these two characters in the foreground here. And over in the active camera view on the right hand side here, you can see that my camera, in fact if I select the camera you should be able to see it there just about, my camera is kind of pulling back through those figures, and then it kind of goes up in the air. But my figures are in the wrong place in Z because I can't really see them doing their little handshake that they're doing. So I want to set up a master controller for these figures, but I actually really need one master controller because all I want to do is move them in Z. So I'm actually going to hook up both characters to the same controller. So what I'll do is I'll come over here and I'll make a new null, just like I did before. And that will be there. I'm going to pull this down to the top of the kind of character layers. And I'll call this character 3D null, like that. And then I'm going to go through all my character layers, which I happen to know start here with this business guy fingers 2, all the way down to the business guy hand there. All those are my kind of character layers. So I've got to go through and check the ones which have no parents. So working my way down, there's one there, it's got no parents, it's none. And then there are some here, and here, and here, and here. And that's got no parent, that's got no parent, and then that's got no parent, and that one, and that one, and the arm. And now that I've got all the ones with no parents selected, I can hook all of those up to that 3D null, like that. And then now I should be able to move, oops, he's not 3D, there we go. Now I should be able to move that 3D null backwards in space and position those characters wherever I want them. Somewhere about there, maybe. Maybe that's a little bit too far, but I think I want to move them up a bit as well. So I'm just going to move the Y And then I think we should now have a shot where we can't see them, and then the camera pulls back between them. We can see them shaking hands, and then we go up to the top. So this sort of 3D native sort of operation of limbo layers didn't work at all in any version previous to 1.5.2 because of the way that the expressions were written on the different limbo layers. So you won't be able to kind of make this work with any characters that you've already created using previous versions. But if you now switch to 1.5.2, then new limbs generated with that version will work like this when you make them 3D. Okay, so the other thing I want to show you is these new limbs that we've added to the limb library. There's one which I'm particularly pleased with called Faux 3D Splits. So if I just open this up, you'll see that we've now got this kind of rounding on the color splits. So they still work kind of just pretty much as normal in terms of where you kind of set things up and down, and obviously we can change color and stuff. But there's these additional expression effect controls on the limb layer itself, which allow this kind of perspective trick, this kind of rounding, to sort of flip the appearance of limbs from sort of one side to the other. Now, obviously, if your limb isn't moving, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But if you're animating a character and your limbs kind of, appearing to sort of rotate in space, maybe go behind the character or come, in front of its torso or whatever, you can get quite a lot of mileage by animating these sort of rounded color splits alongside. You're going to have to do it manually. It's not automatic because obviously there's no way of sort of Limbo knowing exactly which kind of type of foreshortening you're intending to be going on at any point in time, but it does work quite well in terms of giving you this sort of illusion of volume. And the other thing that this limb does is that it has a sort of expansion parameter for each kind of section of the colors as well. So if I just ramp up this lower expansion here, you can see that this middle color, the sort of the parts of the limb that use the middle color are going to get wider like that. And then, of course, the upper sleeve has the same thing as well, but it's not cumulative. So if the lower sleeve is set to 15 and I want the upper sleeve to match, then I'm going to have to set that to 15 as well. Or I could go beyond to make this kind of sort of thing look like each sort of stage is kind of coming out from the one before. Obviously, like you probably wouldn't have all three colors like this, but just to sort of demonstrate. And then obviously that still works with this perspective trick as well. There's a little bit of pop there because it works based on a stroke, and that stroke is kind of getting flipped forwards and backwards. But if you're kind of using one or the other, or if your expansion isn't too sort of pronounced, then you can get some nice kind of flips. And obviously, most likely, those kind of changes across there are going to be happening when it's moving perhaps fairly fast anyway. So you can get this kind of illusion that part of the limb is kind of coming out from a sleeve or something like this, in almost in a kind of faux 3D way. What else have we got? We've also got angled splits, which might be useful for certain types of shadows or whatever. You could, you might want this to be like a very dark shadow, and then because you, maybe are animating, like a leg, and there might be a top that's kind of like the torso or something sort of covering that up, or maybe it's a skirt over some leggings or whatever, and then you might want to animate the angle of these shadows and have a bit more control over it rather than that angle just always being perpendicular to the limb. So now you've got this kind of controls here to just manually operate the kind of tilt of those crops there, and you can see the same thing works for the lower one as well. What else have we got? We've got this knee pad thing, which was Jake Williams asked me to make for him, and I was happy to oblige. But I thought that actually there's something in here that could be useful for a lot of people, which is that sometimes you want something on a limb that kind of points outwards from the knee, and our joint controllers that you can add, don't do that. They always point kind of down the leg, so that you might parent something to them that's kind of like going to run down the leg. But if you want something that actually points out, at this sort of like almost average angle, then this is quite a good way of getting that. So you can see that as we move this around, that knee pad was always going to sort of point outwards of the elbow, which is kind of what you want. I've added some controls to this one to just make this this kind of knee pad work in various ways. So there's some controls to sort of like offset this shape here and offset the strap as well. And then the strap length can be changed like that. But really what's useful about it is just this sort of joint group here that's inside the limb layer. So I'll just twirl this up so you can see from scratch. If we come down here into the contents, into the limb, we've got this new joint group. And that joint group is always going to have its rotation and position automatically set by these new expressions that are going to kind of place it in the right place at the elbow or the knee, but also set its angle. So let's just say I didn't want this pad and strap and path here like that. Let's just say I wanted to make this some kind of piece of armor or something. I'm just going to come and draw what I want. So I want some sort of spiky, thing like this maybe. I just tweak those like that. So now in here, I'm going to take this. I'm going to make this grey, and I'm going to take that shape. I'm going to hit copy, and then I'm going to come into this joint group here and hit paste, and it's going to pop in there. And its orientation's kind of gone all kind of out of whack, but I can kind of figure that out. So if I look in here, I see that the rotation and everything is set to 0. So really what it is it's to do with the actual path itself. So if I now take these points, put them say here, hit Command T to get a free transform box, and then just sort of move it something like that. Looks about right. Then now when I move my end controller, you can see that it's kind of pointing out from the elbow, like you would want a sort of, I don't know what they're called, an armor knee pad, whatever they are, and it sort of stays in the right place. We're going to have to do a little bit more work if we wanted it to kind of neatly join up with this kind of crease fold here, but that's something that we could do by kind of manipulating those other things that were already in there. If we hadn't deleted them, we could put the strap back and change its color and so on and so forth. Anyway, my point is just that this joint group is quite handy for adding things like knee pads. What else have we got? We've got this stroked pant, which is another user request. This time came from James Borman, and he wanted something for one of his characters that had a stroke on the outside and this kind of pocket on here as well. Let me just turn this text off. So you can see that there's a hell of a lot of controls down here on this leg layer. So I'm just going to expand this window a little bit so we can see them all. We can change the stroke color for whatever we want. We can change the stroke width. We can move the pocket around if we wanted that to be lower or whatever. We can change the size of the pocket as well, depending on what's going on with the size of our limb. There's separate controls for the ankle diameter. So, we might want to make this bigger or smaller. And then the knee diameter, which is kind of separate from the trouser itself. We kind of like got separate controls for the kind of skin part of the leg here. And then this flare rotation offset will allow us to just animate the little sort of additional angle of the trousers. And then we can even also animate the actual angle of the bottom of them as well, so that that gives you an extra bit of control there. And obviously that all kind of takes place within the main kind of limber limb. So it's definitely not useful for everything, but it's a kind of useful experiment, and I thought somebody might find it handy. The last one of these new limbs is this swept elbow, which I kind of like, and I think is quite useful for a lot of sort of softer, more illustrative style of characters, where we've just got this angle parameter added to the elbow, which is dynamic. So we can add a little bit of kind of curvature to the elbow here like this, and then it'll work in such a way that when the arm gets or leg gets straight, it kind of like it becomes less curved. And that also means that when we transition from clockwise to anti-clockwise, it's always on the outside, because obviously, like, if that curve stayed on the right hand side, then when we made it anti-clockwise like that, we just have a curve on the inside and not on the outside, and that we don't want that. So this is kind of quite nice for creating a sort of softer, smoother feeling characters, look a bit more hand drawn maybe. And then you've also got the ability to do the inside as well, which to my mind doesn't look quite as nice, but maybe if you turn down the angle so it's not quite so steep, then that might look okay. And yeah, still works with the clockwise and everything as well. Because this is actually quite complicated to do with path expressions to generate these curves, it doesn't work with the color splits. So you just got a single color here that comes from the middle color only. But nevertheless, quite nice shapes are possible with that. Is that the lot? Yes, that's all of them. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new custom limbs in the limb library. And yeah, 2 of those were just, actually no, 3 of those were direct kind of user requests. People just got in touch with me and said, hey, Steve, I want to make a limb that looks like this. Usually they already had a character they designed in Illustrator or something, and they wanted to see if it was possible to make a limb that would kind of work dynamically in the style that they designed, which I really enjoy. That kind of workflow. I think it's really important to, let your imagination run wild and use your design kind of skills independently of what you think may or may not be possible inside After Effects. And quite often people don't quite know how to sort of put the expressions together or how to manipulate the shape layer in the exact way that they want to get the design that they've come up with. And so I'm very happy to sort of listen to people's requests for things, and I can give you advice and maybe even help you kind of put those things together yourself. So if you have a kind of custom limb in mind, by all means, drop me a line, email, or a DM on Twitter or something. And if it's simple, then I'll help out. If it's complicated, I might help out. And if it's impossible, I'll say so. So that's just about everything for Limbo 1.5.2. Have fun with it and happy animating. See you next time. Bye.